A very good evening and welcome to a brand new edition of Face to Face, coming to you direct from our Newsfirst studios here in Colombo. For the Newsfirst team, I am Jaima Ratnayaka, and today we are here to talk about a timely topic that has dominated headlines over the recent past, especially since the start of this month, and that is global trade dynamics, especially in terms of the newly imposed US tariffs. As you know, US President Donald Trump has imposed several retaliatory tariffs on many nations across the world, well, a majority of which has been imposed on China, with China bearing the brunt of those tariffs. In recent days, more developments have occurred, and to dissect those developments, where all of this will end up, will it lead up to a trade war? How will these tariff policies affect global trade and the global playing field? To discuss all of this and much more, we have invited to our studios today Dr. Asanka Wijesinghe, Institute of Policy Studies. He is a research fellow of the Macro Trade and Industry Unit attached to the Institute of Policy Studies. Welcome back to the show, Doctor.
Thank you.
So, Doctor, since the last time you were here, the tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs by President Donald Trump had not been announced. Since then, the tariffs have been announced, the percentages have been announced, and there have been a certain tug of war going on between the US and especially China, whom the majority of the percentage of tariffs were imposed on. And President Donald Trump justified these tariffs, saying that he is on a mission to make America great again by introducing protectionist measures such as high tariffs, and also to balance the trade deficit that America is currently facing. Before we localize this situation and how these tariffs might affect Sri Lanka, as we have heard from preeminent scholars, researchers, and so on over the past few days, let's talk about the global situation. Now, Trump's tariffs and how it would lead to a potential trade war. Day before yesterday, I was watching the news, and Donald Trump's press conference was happening, and he said that he seemed to have taken back what he said about China and the 145% tariffs that they were going to impose on China, saying that the percentage of those tariffs weren't going to be as high. And he seems to have taken a certain U-turn in his interpretation and his stance on these retaliatory tariffs, especially saying that the tariffs were not going to be as high as they initially announced. So, is this a case of Trump coming to a realization that trade without China, trying to isolate China, is a vain task and that is a futile effort? And where has Trump's hubris gone, that arrogance of making America great again and making it that industrial country once more, gone? Has he come to a realization that China is here to stay?
If you look back at the 2024 election campaign, President Trump's argument was there will be high tariff for some countries and a global tariff like 10% or 20% for all the other. So right now we are in this campaign promise kind of situation.
Era, yes.
10% for all the countries, and there are some sectoral tariff like steel, aluminium, and auto tariff will come in May. And China has up to 145 tariff. However, it should be evaluated looking at the global value chains. So most of this US manufacturing is happening using Chinese raw materials. And China has some in certain sectors, for example, electric vehicles, they have near monopoly in components. So it is very difficult task to decouple fully from China. There were various allegations against China like currency manipulation and those things. However, if you look at China has achieved a remarkable productivity advantage. So they can produce things with comparative advantage in general term. It is like they produce it with minimum resources, maybe labor or other resources. So it is a very difficult task for US to decouple totally. I think that was the signal sent by the stock markets. This Wall Street response might have prompted President Trump and the administration to rethink about the very high tariff. So now the argument is that they will bring it down to like 60%. However, 60% is still very high rate of tariff. In 2024, when economists were calculating the cost of trade war, the cost of 60% tariff was also very high, substantial. There were estimates like about 1.2% GDP of the US will be lost by 60%.
I see. So still on the topic of US and China, we know, especially after the Second World War, the United States has been the centerpiece of the global world order, and the USA was the creator of this rule-based world order. But recent decisions by President Trump has seemed as if he is planning to walk away from that world order, whereas the rest of the world still want to continue in that path. Do these decisions act in the best interest of the United States, or is he intentionally or unintentionally undermining the best interests of the United States of America?
Well, if you talk with 10 economists, more than 9 will say free trade is the best for a country. It maximizes national wealth. But there were some problems. For example, when a country removes tariff and involved in free trade, certain sectors can be affected. Some of the producers might not be productive. They cannot face the competition. That's what happened after around 1990s with China's accession to WTO. Some of the US sectors could not compete with Chinese products. As a result of that, there were some localized effects, like states like Ohio, for example, Vice President's estate. They faced unemployment, even sometimes some other social issues like even suicide rates like that. So these issues are coming from the import competition, and when countries do not have a solution for that.
I see.
Some countries have trade adjustment packages. That means they identify the affected communities, then they have retraining programs or some cash transfers. But it was not so effective in the US. That was the reason why President Trump ran the campaign in 2016 in this protectionist platform and won the election. Now, the question is, will these protectionist measures that bring the jobs back to the US? It is not going to happen because one thing is, even if they could bring some of the jobs, automation will use robots and the machines. They are not going to generate more jobs. The other thing is, it is very difficult to establish plants like aluminium, ready-made garments. When you try to produce everything, the national wealth inevitably goes down.
Yes.
That is what we see in all of these macroeconomic models and forecasts. The US GDP will go down by about 1.2% in a full trade war scenario. That means they impose tariff and China retaliates, EU retaliates, and Canada, Mexico retaliates. That's the problem. So these measures will not maximize the US wealth. Even if you look at some of the downstream manufacturers, for example, manufacturing firms using steel and some auto components, they are laying off people now. So it is obvious that this is not going to work.
So one of the reasonings behind Trump's protectionist policies, I was listening to a speech by one of the researchers recently, and his argument is that what Trump is trying to do is to create jobs for the bottom 50% of the US citizenry, because as we know that the wealth of the US is a majority of the wealth rather of the US is being held by the top 10% or the top 0.1%, and these policies decisions by President Donald Trump are made to cater to that bottom 50% in terms of job creation and so on. So do you agree with that school of thought? And in this context, if there are protectionist measures and that is Trump's thinking, do you believe the bottom 50% in the US citizenry rather, will benefit from these policies?
So there are some. That's what I was explaining about this globalization effect and job losses in the US. So the idea was that these low skilled, high school educated white men who did not have a college degree, they were the most affected people by this globalization. So President Trump's party, Republican Party, they were promising that they will reshore jobs. Well, protectionist measures will bring some jobs, but at a very high cost. It is. You should look at it like this. Person is not only a worker, they are consumers too. We consume products. The free trade lowers the price. So Americans benefited because of these lower prices. Now they are going to pay very high prices. I think within 2 weeks they will face product shortages in the market because the shipments from China has stopped. Some reports are saying they are about 30%. Then the inflation will be very high. When the inflation is high, generally the poorest segments of the society suffer because major portion of their income goes for food and these day-to-day necessities. That is the problem. And if you look at the job creation, as I said, jobs will not be created as much as expected. One thing is automation, because it is necessary for them to be competitive and productive. The other thing is that these are low-tech manufacturing. For example, ready-made garment or making a shoe in the US. Nobody will be willing to pay like $500 for a pair of shoes, but if you produce that in Vietnam or China, they can do that for like maybe $50 or $100
at a much lesser rate.
Yeah. So people may not be willing to work in this low-tech manufacturing. Even if you look at the bottom percent, for example, West Virginia or some very rural areas, Kentucky, their income is not very low as in Vietnam or Sri Lanka. If you look at the average income of the US, it is like 60,000 household income. These people will not work in these low-tech manufacturing firms.
I see. So let's talk about Trump's interpretation of US national power. Based on the decisions he has made and the retaliatory tariffs, one of the main reasons why these tariffs were imposed is to balance the trade deficit the US is currently having. But when you take the flip side of it and talk about the wealth creators in the 21st century, in the contemporary age, when it comes to quantum computing, AI, software services, and so on, America is still a key player, and they have many of those industries within the country that are profiting greatly. So does this show that or indicate that Trump still wants America to go back by about 40 years into an industrialist state instead of harnessing the potential of these new technologies and the new industries who are in fact generating more wealth than industries of days gone by?
Yeah, that's the problem. That if you look at the trade deficit in goods trade, yes, US has a trade deficit with some countries, maybe China, EU, even with Sri Lanka. But when you factor in the service sector trade, they have a trade surplus.
Yes.
Because they have a very high comparative advantage in the service sector, maybe IT, even the social media and everything. So they are not factoring in that aspect. It is not the only thing. When a country has a trade deficit, it means they have a surplus in the capital account. That means they are bringing investment outside of the country. If you look at the investment from EU, China, Japan, it is very high. So they are discarding all of these dynamics and thinking maybe industrialization motive is because of some of that maybe lower educated workers in states like Ohio. But there were selective measures. For example, Biden administration, they were also worrying about that adversaries. Of course, we know that China and US have some tug of war. They thought China will use their dominance in certain sectors will be used in an economic warfare or something like that. For example, semiconductor market, EV battery market, and certain pharmaceuticals. So Biden administration had some selective measures to promote domestic manufacturing. It might be okay. It might be the least cost way to be resilient in supply chain. But this is like trying to produce everything within the US cannot be explained. And if you look at the cost, we are economists. We think the economic players are rational. We make the rational decisions after thorough cost-benefit analysis. So in that framework, we cannot explain this. We cannot explain this move because we are sure that the costs are very high compared to whatever the benefits Trump administration expect from this trade war. I think that realization is reaching them in the last couple of weeks. That is why we see a lot of stories like exemptions. For example, about 2 weeks ago, there was this exemption list, mainly electric equipment, phones, laptops, and those things. Because China and other countries, South Korea, they have a major share in these things. Price was estimated like iPhone could be like $2,400. Price could go up.
Yes.
And the auto tariff was postponed until 3rd of May.
I see.
Now the rumor is that that will be also postponed.
Yeah. I see.
So these things show that their thinking was wrong, and they might be trying to de-escalate trade war to minimize the impact on the US economy.
Right. So talking about the global trade dynamics and global power plays as a whole, it's no surprise when you say America reigned supreme over the rest of the world when it came to the past 5-6 decades. But in recent times, especially since the turn of the century, the global south has been asserting its dominance and punching above its weight to show America that they too can pull their own weight and make a very significant influence. Especially countries like China, countries like India, they have been coming up in the world, especially economically. And it's common consensus that the 21st century has been dubbed the Asian century. And for Sri Lanka, as a country which is part of the larger region of Asia and South Asia, with India being our neighbor, which is another rising global superpower, what sort of benefits can Sri Lanka obtain through these rising powers and the shift of the global power play moving from the north to the south?
Well, with this trade war and everything, people talk a lot about finding alternative markets. Some countries like East Asia, we have also written about the benefits of joining regional comprehensive economic partnership. It is like 10 ASEAN countries and 5 other countries. China is there, Japan is there. All of these, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, those countries are in this group. However, we should understand one thing. The current basket of production is dominated by ready-made garments and some rubber products, tea, coconut products like that. We don't have buyers in the Asian countries. They are sometimes our competitors.
But there are buyers in the West.
Exactly. We have buyers in the West, especially in the US and the EU. That is why we cannot give up these markets, or we cannot compensate the export fallout from the other countries. It doesn't say that we should not look into the East Asian countries maybe, or India. They have a growing middle class, and most of the manufacturing value chains are happening in the regional comprehensive economic partnership. We can be component producers. With this product basket, we cannot benefit from this growing economy in the region. Instead of that, we need to innovate into new products. That is why we were always saying free trade agreement with this ASEAN region might be really beneficial. The other thing is India has a growing middle class. The entire the population is like 1.2 billion. That means there's a significant portion of the middle class. They might be demanding more quality processed food, organic food, or they might be willing to buy highly branded ready-made
apparels. Yes.
Right now there is a quota under in the Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement. Sri Lanka cannot export all the products under this free trade concession, but a quota is
allocated
there. If we can increase this quota or remove the quota and get the market taxes, then it will be beneficial. However, most of these trade concessions are not like, we call this non-reciprocal. For example, EU give us GSP plus. It is a non-reciprocal trade arrangement. We don't need to give anything to
the EU.
I mean, economically. We need to sign, implement some of the conventions.
Yes.
But tariff concession, we don't need to give. But if you are going to sign a free trade agreement with the RCEP region or expand India's free trade agreement, inevitably we will have to make some concession for them. Then Sri Lanka will have to lower our tariff rate, break this.
Facilitate greater imports from those countries and so on.
Then these protectionist barriers we also have, CES, PAL and many things.
I see.
Sri Lanka should be ready to implement.
To compromise.
Yeah, compromise.
I see. So when talking about Sri Lanka's export revenue, day before yesterday, the president was speaking at a rally, and he said that his government hopes to make 2025 the year which Sri Lanka generated the highest export revenue. And he said that in January and February, the numbers show that export revenue has been greater than in previous years. So they are on track to make 2025 the year with the highest export revenue in Sri Lanka. But there have also been concerns that Sri Lanka has lacked, like you mentioned, the export diversification when it comes to the gamut of product offerings Sri Lanka has to export. And we saw that in very clear contrast, because when America announced these retaliatory tariffs, Sri Lanka's apparel sector was going to take a major hit, because Sri Lankan apparels, a majority of Sri Lankan apparels are exported to the USA. So how important is it for Sri Lanka to focus, if it is to earn a higher export revenue, how important is it for Sri Lanka to focus on diversifying its products and services that it exports, and to ensure that it creates a resilient economy that will withstand any of these sudden external shocks?
Yes, actually, I saw today that we have the first quarter export
numbers
results now. Yeah. It is impressive. There was like, I think about 8% growth compared to
year on year
last year. It is very good news compared to factoring in all of our problems, like debt, payment and everything. So we are on track to achieve substantial export growth. However, we need to factor in the WTO and IMF forecast because of the trade war. If there will be a full-blown trade war, world trade will collapse, contract by some percentage point. It will affect Sri Lanka in some way, so it can reduce the momentum of this growth. So about the diversification, diversification is not a short-term thing, like we cannot innovate into new products within this year.
Yes.
Your point is true. We were calculating these values. About 37% of Sri Lanka's manufacturing of wearing apparel goes to the US. And the other major portion is going to the EU.
I see.
Yeah, and mainly these three markets, EU countries. UK, we send about 1 billion. And again, US about 1.7 billion. The total export is about 4.7 billion when it comes to wearing apparel.
Yes.
Then again, another 1 or 2 billion agricultural products. We have some diversified products, especially in the electric component manufacturing. I think in 2024, Sri Lanka exported close to 500 million. But it is a nascent, like a growing industry. That is the market we missed in 1990s. If you compare Sri Lanka with Malaysia, Indonesia, so they joined this manufacturing of electric equipment, components, advanced chips, semiconductors. So now Sri Lanka's task is to identify what are the domestic policy barriers that constrain this joining to global value chain. We call this as anti-export bias in Sri Lanka because if we have a resource like land or manpower, the incentives are high for you to allocate those things for products consumed by the domestic market.
I see.
Because of the tariff protection given for them. If we remove this tariff, then people will think, okay, we need to be competitive with the other market. Then the production will be allocated to export-oriented sectors. So we need deep structural changes, like very patchy kind of solutions are not going to diversify. That is why we need to have a plan maybe for like 15, 16 years to phase out all of these high tariff barriers and join countries like RCEP. RCEP gives us a framework for that. For example, Sri Lanka, Thailand Free Trade Agreement. The tariff liberalization plan is 16 years. That means we have 16 years to phase out tariff.
I see.
Yeah, same thing goes with most of the RCEP countries. Yeah. So we should follow that path.
Understood. So we are currently in a conversation with Dr. Asanka Wijesinghe from the Institute of Policy Studies. We have been discussing the global trade dynamics, especially in light of the retaliatory tariffs imposed by the United States of America, how other countries have responded, how Sri Lanka will be affected, and the way forward. We have much to discuss, but we must cross over for a short commercial break. Stay tuned to Face to Face. We will be right back.
Newsfirst, Face to Face with Jamal Ratnayaka.
Entertainments.
ඔබේ ගමේ නගරේ දේශපාලනයේ හෙට දවස සතිය දිනවල සවස 6:00ට සුබදින හැම විට එක වගේ කරගෙන කටදිව පිනවන රස කුරගෙනගෙන රුවනෝදෙහි
Entertainments.
Newsfirst, Face to Face with Jamal Ratnayaka.
Welcome back to Face. My guest tonight is Dr. Asanka Wijesinghe, representing the Institute of Policy Studies. We are currently talking about global trade dynamics, especially in light of newly imposed US tariffs. Before we crossed over, Doctor, we were talking about the RCEP countries and how Sri Lanka can leverage its position in the region to strike deals with RCEP countries. You spoke about the Sri Lanka-Thailand Free Trade Agreement. When it comes to bilateral agreements of this nature, and to cushion the potential fallout from trade when it comes to countries in the West export. How can Sri Lanka leverage its position currently to strike deals with countries from RCEP, and what sort of free trade agreements must it sign for the long-term export growth in our country?
Yeah. One clarification is, as I said early, there might not be markets to compensate any immediate fallout
Yes.
coming from the US market. But as a long-term solution, of course, we need to work on market access. RCEP is a major opportunity for that. There are I think there are about 15 countries. We call this as ASEAN plus 5.
I see.
ASEAN plus 5 ASEAN countries and 5 other countries. China, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia.
Okay. These are all large markets.
Yeah, it is a large market. These are called as mega free trade agreements. This RCEP is there. There is another one called CPTPP. CPTPP was kind of a byproduct of Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trans-Pacific Partnership also became a victim of Trump policy. Trump withdrew US from Trans-Pacific Partnership. But without US, other countries went ahead and they called it as CPTP.
Okay.
Now Sri Lanka, I think Sri Lanka has a policy goal joining RCEP. In that direction, Sri Lanka has signed 2 free trade agreements now. The thing with RCEP is a country needs to sign 15 free trade agreements with all the member countries of the RCEP.
Okay.
Then we can enter into this RCEP regional agreement. That means 15 negotiations. It is logistically a bit of a difficult task, but Sri Lanka has already signed Singapore, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, Sri Lanka. As I know, China, Sri Lanka negotiations were going for quite
some time,
bit of period. So 3 agreements already we are making some progress.
Yes.
There was some talks about Indonesia, Sri Lanka preferential trade agreement. Preferential trade agreements are generally less powerful than free trade agreements.
I see.
Preferential means you liberalize selectively for only maybe
for certain industries or products.
300 products.
Okay.
Like that. But it is something like a starting point to sign a free trade agreement.
It's a full free trade agreement, yes.
So Sri Lanka will have to look into this and start negotiating because it is quite a very technical process and it takes some time. I think Thailand, Sri Lanka one was started like 2018, and if you know that Singapore one was signed in 2018, but enforcement was delayed until like 2023. Now in Sri Lanka's tariff schedule, you can see Singapore, Sri Lanka free trade agreement concessions. So this is the way forward, trying to get market access to the other countries, go in regions, for example, ASEAN. India, I think India-Sri Lanka free trade agreement, the talk was always to expand the coverage and to make it more effective. South Asian free trade agreements are generally not that effective because we call this as half-hearted liberalization. We keep most of the products in sensitive list.
I see.
We do not liberalize much.
Okay.
So EDCA was kind of a more comprehensive one. So Sri Lanka will have to look into those aspects to get market access
as well
to the growing region.
Okay, so Sri Lanka is currently in an IMF program, and when Sri Lanka's economy was going through a major downturn during the economic crisis in 2022, countries such as India, China, and America stepped up to assist, chief being India with over $4 billion in support. And when Sri Lanka is navigating these complex waters, there are also certain diplomatic ties which might come into play, where a certain country might not want Sri Lanka doing too much trade with another country. For example, So how does Sri Lanka navigate all these complexities in a world that seems to be more polarized than ever before, especially after what happened earlier in April with the US's reciprocal tariffs, and ensure that diplomatic relations are also maintained, but Sri Lanka works towards gaining access to greater markets, larger markets, and increasing its export share?
Yeah. So it is very challenging. One thing is we cannot expect other countries to use their ties with maybe US to talk on behalf of us. It is not happening right now. Almost all the countries are kind of panicked. They try to get concession for their countries. That is the danger of the breaking down of this rule-based trading system. Rule-based trading system means there was this most favored nation status given for all the WTO members.
Right.
When there were certain cases like safeguard tariff, then only some of the sectors were targeted. But overall, there were no trade uncertainty. But right now, with this individualized reciprocal tariff, all the countries are trying to give concessions to the US and get this tariff lowered.
Reduced.
So
yes.
we are facing this problem
as
now.
well.
In this case, Sri Lanka will have to individually negotiate with the US as a single country and think about what concessions we can give. And in the meantime, keep a good relationship with the ASEAN countries, China and India, of course. We might be in trouble if we try to get benefits out of at the expense of some other countries. China might be worried about countries entering into deals with the US at their expense.
Right. And they have also, I believe, issued a statement over such countries making deals with the US compromising China's interests as well. I believe a couple of days ago they had made a statement regarding it.
I think they might have targeted countries like Vietnam and South Korea. These countries were benefited from US-China trade war in 2018.
I see.
Because most of the firms relocated into Vietnam. But we need to understand that it is not going to benefit if US has this protectionist kind of trade policy for a long time. You can see in reciprocal tariff, Vietnam was also targeted. One goal was that they wanted to discourage firms moving to Vietnam. It is very interesting if you look at this trade deficit talk. Although US was reducing trade deficit with China, it was expanding trade deficit with the other countries. That means trade was shifting to other countries. So Sri Lanka will have to be really careful not to be in these blocks or be a part of political alliances. One thing is BRICS actually. I think it is a political alliance. It will be problematic for Sri Lanka to be a part of that. Instead of that, economic alliances are mutually beneficial, and also we can justify that for any other country worrying about that. That's why Sri Lanka should look into more free trade agreements rather than using political alliances.
Right. So talking about the future outlook, depending on how all of these scenarios might pan out, and if there is a full-blown trade war, what sort of policies must Sri Lanka adopt to navigate this trade war?
Now, already we are in this trade war actually. Sri Lanka's first impact came with this steel and aluminium tariff in 12th of March, as I remember. But we are not exporting a lot to the US in aluminium and steel. It might be about 100 million altogether. Now we are at 10%, MFN plus 10%. And one worry is whether the content of this product, for example, raw materials we are using, can be a problem, this rules of origin issues. So our tariff rate can be even higher in that case. So these are the challenges Sri Lanka is currently facing. The first policy goal should be to avoid 44%. 44% tariff might be really prohibitive level of tariff. Sri Lanka will see industries moving out of the country if we have 44%
tariffs. Yes.
You can see countries like Kenya. They have relatively low tariff rate, reciprocal tariff rate. So these are the countries ambitious of moving into
gaining advantage of these reciprocal tariffs.
Those low-tech manufacturing,
right?
Mainly African countries. So they might be our competitors. So Sri Lanka should negotiate with the US to stop this 44%. And if there will be 44%, inevitably the export revenue will go down. Then in Sri Lanka will have to think about the workers because ready-made garment sector is employing mostly rural female workers.
Yes.
These are the most vulnerable
population.
Vulnerable population in the country. So mainly they don't have these unemployment benefits or any other safeguard mechanism. So Sri Lanka will have to think about those things. Social ramifications, for example.
That will widen the social benefit net as well.
Yes, and we don't have unemployment benefit scheme in Sri Lanka. This might be a good opportunity to think about these structural changes. The other thing is, if this will become a macroeconomic problem, then we will be seeing high inflation, and even our macroeconomic targets like this debt payment, those can be affected. Revenue targets can be affected. So Sri Lanka will have to manage this fiscal space really carefully in the coming period of months.
Right. So very quickly, Doctor, before we wrap up this evening, I want to ask you about Sri Lanka's access to global value chains. We touched upon it earlier on the show, but since we were talking predominantly on tariffs, where can Sri Lanka find the ideal opportunities to access the global value chain? Because we know in the 21st century, nowadays, in the contemporary age, no single product is manufactured in one single country. That was the case several decades ago. But even if you take a smartphone, for example, the hardware, the components are manufactured in multiple different countries where it comes to one particular manufacturing warehouse or factory. It gets assembled. How can Sri Lanka access the global value chain, especially when it comes to providing these components that are needed in large scale, where Sri Lanka can benefit through the sheer quantity that is required? And how can you access? Do we hang on the coattails of, for example, India per se, when we are making inroads to the global value chain?
Well, yes, Sri Lanka's current state of technology is very much kind of assembly kind of country. So our comparative advantage is in assembly activities.
I see.
So right now we need to understand it is very, very important because there is this analogy of forest. In one tree there is a monkey. So for that monkey, it is very convenient and easy to jump to the next tree rather than 10 trees away. For example, right now Sri Lanka is producing t-shirts, shirts. Then it may be very convenient for us to jump to some assembly activities like in vehicles maybe. Not to produce something like nuclear reactors.
Or components.
So Sri Lanka's policymakers and some of these industrialists that advocates of industrialization, they think we can produce this very high technology thing and that should be our target. It is not going to work.
That's not the case.
We were looking into this EV battery, for example, whether Sri Lanka has an opportunity to produce EV batteries, because we have graphite here in Sri Lanka.
I see. Yes.
It's a very high purity graphite. But unfortunately, the scale is not that high. In that case, we need innovative solutions, like maybe we link with a regional small player. Maybe a vehicle producer in India. Then sign an agreement with them. We produce graphite, purify them to some extent, and export. So we need to change our thinking pattern like that. We should not have these very unrealistic dreams like producing an entire thing within the country.
The country, right.
If you ask me what we can do to accelerate this process, join in this process, so countries joined these manufacturing value chains through producing competitively, lowering trade barriers, and attracting foreign direct investment. These are the areas Sri Lanka is very weak. One thing is we have a very outdated way of giving concessions to the foreign investors. We need to change that. There is this bureaucratic red tape and everything. When it comes to export facilitation and those things, we don't have a national single window, for example. Right now, we are talking about these things for like 10 years. Right now, Sri Lanka is progressing towards these things. These trade facilitation measures should be implemented. Then investors will come. When our logistic performance index and everything go up, naturally they will
when
come.
Investor confidence also rises.
Exactly. And when we remove these protectionist barriers for a country, the workers also, they have an incentive to join a factory, work in that factory.
Yes.
Then when the situation is like that, the investors will think, okay, Sri Lanka is a good place to go, like Vietnam, Malaysia. They will think of moving into Sri Lanka.
Understood. My guest this evening was Dr. Asanka Wijesinghe from the Institute of Policy Studies. He is a research fellow attached to the Institute of Policy Studies, particularly in the macro trade and industry unit. We spoke about global trade, how reciprocal tariffs that were imposed by America has disrupted global trade, and how countries like Sri Lanka should address and build resilient policies to navigate these complexities, and also to develop an economy which will remain resilient in the face of external shocks of this nature. Thank you very much, Dr. Wijesinghe, for joining me this evening and educating me and also our viewers on all things trade. That's unfortunately the end of today's episode of Face to Face. Thank you very much for stopping by. We will see you again tomorrow. Until then, take care and stay safe.
News First, face to face with Jamal Ratnayaka.